For now, though, it's over to Warwick Hadfield for the Sports Factor.
Thanks, Mark. This week, as South Africa celebrates its first 10 years as a democracy, the story of Dr. Ali Bacher and the fight to give cricket a respected place in the new Rainbow Nation, a fight that changed his life.
I was betting for my life, for my credibility, which had been savagely destroyed after the Gadding Tour, particularly amongst black South Africans, and I was also battling for cricket.
He's a husband, a father, you could call him a human rights activist, a politician, a statesman, diplomat, marketer, publicist, administrator, fundraiser, promoter, philanthropist, you name him. I mean, it is just extraordinary, the number of things that he's done through his life in the name particularly of South African cricket.
In the 1980s, Ali Bacher, the son of Jewish refugees who'd fled from Europe to South Africa just before the Second World War, had become one of the most reviled figures in international sport. Before that time, Bacher had publicly opposed apartheid and also the racist South African government, particularly in 1970 when he was captain of the last all-white team to appear in international cricket. But a decade later, as head of the whites-only South African Cricket Union, he was organising rebel tours by English, Sri Lankan, West Indian and Australian teams. And all these tours were in breach of the international boycotts aimed at destroying apartheid and were bitterly opposed by sporting and political groups around the world. With the sting now gone out of all the arguments, Bacher admits he should have known why those tours, and particularly the last one in 1990 led by the former England captain Mike Gatting, were so offensive to the majority of South Africans.
I don't believe we understood fully the reality of South Africa, what was happening in South Africa, call it at grassroots level. We didn't understand exactly what the fight against apartheid was about. We lived very much in a cocoon because in the 80s in particular there was a state of emergency. The press had restrictions. They were not allowed to mention Nelson Mandela's name or to quote any senior ANC official. So we didn't comprehend and understand the true reality of what was transpiring in South Africa. It was only during the Gatting Tour, January, February of 1990, which turned out to be a watershed in the history of South African sport, because for the very first time, and this is to the credit of the then President of the Republic of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, that he made it possible, he legalized peaceful protest. In the mid-80s, if black South Africans had come to the Wanderers Stadium to protest against Kim Hughes' rebel tour, it was illegal and they would have ended up in jail. But now the process had changed. And thousands of South Africans, black South Africans, came to 4 matches, one in Kimberley, one in Bloemfontein, one in Pietermaritzburg and one in Joburg, and expressed in no uncertain terms their total abhorrence of apartheid and of these rebel tours,
But
which in essence was benefiting mainly the white people of this country. And it was only then that I realized for the first time what their viewpoint was about these particular tours. And had I known in retrospect this abhorrence about these tours, I believe we would have thought twice about entertaining those tours.
Any of the tours at all? The West Indian Rebel Tour, the Australian Rebel Tour, the Sri Lankan one?
Correct.
Now, with that Gatting Tour, you actually arranged a permit for a demonstration against one of the games, so you became the first ever cricket official in the history of the game to organise a demonstration against his own game.
Well, the first match was in Kimberley, and I was informed that thousands of South Africans, black South Africans, were marching to the cricket field, and the police stopped them. It was a hot day, the road was dusty, and there was tension plentiful. If I think back on that day, I was fearful that the police, with their guns, they just needed a minor spark, and you could have possibly have had another sharp war when scores of South Africans, black South Africans, were killed during one of the bleakest days in the history of this country. And I just realized I just had to do something to diffuse the tension. I had said always, before that tour, that I would support and did support the right of people to protest peacefully. as I said also, that they should also acknowledge the right that if people wanted to come watch those particular matches, they should be given free access to the grounds. And I'd made a couple of calls to the Ministry of Sport, and we worked out very quickly that the only way to diffuse this tension was for me personally to go to the magistrate in Kimberley and get permission on behalf of the demonstrators for them to protest at that match.
Now, Ali, on the way to do that,
Yes.
though, one of the demonstrators called out to you, "I don't believe you, Ali Bacher, you're a liar." Those words would have been ringing in your ears then. How was your feeling of that?
Not only that comment, but with my strong political views and convictions, and now placed in a situation that people with whom I'd had empathy with regard to their political views, that I was now on the opposite side. It was emotionally very disturbing for me. I mean, it nearly destroyed me, that tour.
You're essentially, you were being called by the whole world a racist, weren't you?
Yeah, and it nearly destroyed me. And, you know, after the Gadding tour, there was a period for about 2-3 months where at lunchtime I would leave my office at the cricket board, go home and pull out the plug, something which I've never done before.
When you say pull out the plug, what do you mean?
At the telephone.
So that the world couldn't contact you?
I wouldn't receive any calls.
Dr. Ali Bacher.
I have always been conscious of my responsibility to the public of Australia, and in particular, my image among the youth of Australia. In reconsidering the South African Cricket Union offer, I was encouraged by the public support in Australia for the players who had agreed to tour South Africa.
I've taken the decision to tour South Africa during the coming winter. I do not believe that my playing cricket in South Africa can be construed as a victory for apartheid. On the contrary, I'll be playing cricket in a system that has been developed by the South African Cricket Union specifically to bring about change and to provide new opportunities for all communities.
Kim Hughes, the former Australian captain, and also the English off-spinner David Graveney, with some of the arguments used to justify the rebel tours of the 1980s. One person fiercely opposed to those tours was the Australian commentator Mike Coward. He understands now, though, what motivated Bacher to lead the likes of Hughes and Graveney along that unholy path.
I first came across him many years ago when he invited me to South Africa as a cricket writer. This was the old South Africa, and I made it patently clear to him that I wasn't interested in going to a country with institutionalised racism as such existed in South Africa at the time. And he came back to me and he said, yes, he understood that, but etc., etc., etc. So I always followed him with interest because beneath it all there was a passion. And I had great sympathy for him inasmuch as that he believed, particularly as the chief executive first of Transvaal and then of the old South African Cricket Association, that he had to keep alive international cricket in South Africa. So hence he had to embrace the rebel tours.
Just explain what those rebel tours were.
Well, it was an interesting situation because South Africa had been isolated, of course, by the wider sporting community, in fact, indeed by the wider community because of the apartheid regimes. He and his fellow executives went each year to the International Cricket Council conferences in London in the hope that they could see that South Africa was making some attempts within the cricket community. But because there was the great belief then, you know, you couldn't have normal sport in an abnormal society. And that was the philosophy that was being espoused at Lord's at the time. So each year that Bacher and his crew went to Lord's, the door was slammed firmly in their face. He worried very much about international cricket, that there would be a generation of young people coming through who had no concept. After all, he had been the last man to lead an international South African side in the Test match arena in 1970-71. And so the approaches came. Firstly, of course, there was the tour of Graham Gooch's side in 1981.
That was from England?
It was from England. That was followed quickly by a Sri Lankan side, followed by a West Indian side. But while all this was going on, there was also negotiations for the first of the Australian sides.
That Australian tour went ahead, but I guess the one that is pivotal in the history of Dr. Bacher's life, almost an epiphany, was the 1989 tour when England toured again under Mike Gadding this time. And really, Ali, it was an error of judgment, really, wasn't it? Because so much was happening in South Africa, so much change was underway, that this was one tour too many?
Very much so, very much so. I mean, it was such a dramatic time in South Africa in 1989-90, and it was just into 1990 when they were there. It was only days before Nelson Mandela was to be released. There was just so much uneasiness and so much restlessness. And Ali Bacher now looks back with great pain that he didn't recognise earlier in his life, particularly given his Jewish heritage, I think, and his sensitivity to the disadvantaged, to the disenfranchised and to the disaffected, that he hadn't seen earlier the great iniquities that were happening in his own country. And this pains him to this day, but to his undying credit, he worked so hard for so long, particularly with the United Cricket Board. Of course, he was fundamental in the formation of that with Krish Makadoosh, and of course in the new South Africa from Mandela's government right through to recent times. The relationship he set up with Steve Tshweti, the first sports minister in Mandela's government, a black man and a black man of great vision.
Cricket commentator Mike Coward. On the Sports Factor on Radio National, you're listening to the story of Ali Bacher's fight to keep cricket alive in the new South Africa.
Alexandra is one of the worst areas in the Republic of South Africa. I would like to encourage more and more children to take part in cricket. This is a wonderful sport. It brings the children together in one spirit. They are enjoying themselves.
Come on, there you go, Captain. Right, out you come out the circle, in you come, in the middle, you take his place. Right, make it dive, make it dive.
Cricket has brought a great change into my life. Since cricket has been born into our black children, I think it takes the top stand within South Africa.
So we have started paying attention to one another. We greet one another, we know one another, we visit one another in the white suburbs, in the black townships. Honestly, I'm telling you, long live cricket.
In the second half of the 1980s, Ali Bacher had been conducting cricket coaching clinics in the townships of South Africa. And as we heard just then, these had been embraced enthusiastically by many community leaders like Solly Mashaloni, Berta Nicolamo and Masilo Mokatala. However, these clinics also had their critics, with many calling them window dressing. During the Gatting tour, the opposition became so fierce, these programs had to be abandoned. This too was a crushing blow for Bacher, who had by now grown to believe the future champions of South African cricket would come not from the traditional areas of white privilege, but from the townships. Then came a moment which was not only led to their revival, but a whole new chapter in Bacher's life, his friendship with Steve Tshweti. Like Nelson Mandela, Tshweti had spent many years on the dreaded Robben Island, the prison off the coast of Cape Town to which opponents of apartheid were sent. Bacher remembers their first meeting in 1990.
Prior to the Gatting tour and after the Gatting tour, I used to go visit a Dr. Frederick van Zyl Slabbert, a high-profile Afrikaner. He was a good rugby player, and in the 80s he was leader of the white opposition. And then in a dramatic moment in the late 80s, he left Parliament because he saw no use to that parliamentary structure which only incorporated the white people of South Africa. And I always had a lot of respect for him. And after the Gatting tour, I went to see him on many occasions, and I can recall about 2-3 months after the Gatting tour, there was in Johannesburg for the very first time a high-profile meeting between the African National Congress and top businessmen in South Africa, mainly white businessmen. And he phoned me about 10:30 that night. And he said, "Ollie, I want you to go down to Indensani, which is a black township adjacent to East London, and meet Steve Tshweti." Now, I had never ever heard of Steve Tshweti. As it turned out to be, he was the ANC Shadow Minister of Sport. And it was a Friday night. I had a driver who took me into Indensani, and I met Steve for the very first time. And I was betting for my life, for my credibility, which had been savagely destroyed after the Gatting tour, particularly amongst black South Africans. And I was also battling for cricket, because the townships were now close to us, and the development program, which had started to really have a meaningful impact on many young South Africans in the towns in the late 80s, this access was cut off to us. And for half an hour, I just batted for our life, really. And Steve had then thick-rimmed glasses. He just looked at me. He never said a word. And at the end of the half an hour, he put out his hand and he said, "Ollie, I'll help you." And he restored confidence in me because deep down, he did believe that there was honesty and integrity within the development program, which was our way of redressing imbalances in cricket via the apartheid years. And he never stopped assisting me, and I had a wonderful association with him during the 90s. He came with me to the World Cup in Australia in 92. A wonderful person, a very soft and compassionate person, and tragically he died a couple of years ago.
Now, Ali, as you said, you became a very, very close friend of Steve Sweaty's. You went to England, and I think you went on a train trip from London to Birmingham, and it was there that for the first and I think the only time he told you about some of the things that happened to him when he was imprisoned on Robben Island.
I think the most gripping story, well, it's not a story, it was a fact, where he was placed in solitary confinement on Robben Island for 9 months. And what that entailed is that for 18 hours of the day, he was locked in his own cell, dark, no light, without any visitors whatsoever. And then he was allowed for 6 hours to walk in a courtyard on his own, and once again, there was no light. So he was in virtual darkness for 24 hours a day. And this carried on for 9 months. And I can recall him telling me that when he was ultimately released from solitary confinement, the door was opened, he walked out, and for the first time in 9 months, he saw the sun, he saw light. And he swirled around, like somebody drunk, and killed over. Now, when somebody relates that experience to you, and it happened to hundreds of thousands of South Africans who were interned, who were locked up in jail around the country, and you see where we are today, and you see the capacity of these people to forgive their oppressors, it's surely got to be one of the most remarkable attributes of any group of people in this world. It's absolutely extraordinary, the capacity to forgive their oppressors.
Cricket commentator Mike Coward says their story is not the only notable one, though, to emerge from the end of apartheid.
Bacher's story is absolutely remarkable, and it's not just a remarkable story of a sports administrator, it's a remarkable story of a man in South Africa at one of its most dramatic times in its evolution.
One of the things that he must surely always be remembered for is the mini cricket, the township cricket. He went out to the townships in 1986 and began holding coaching clinics for young, underprivileged, black, coloured, non-whites, as they were all known in South Africa at that time. Do you sense then that that was also a pivotal moment for him when he would have seen in the townships so many of the iniquities?
Oh, unquestionably. In fact, I can always remember talking to his son David, who himself was an able cricketer, and he said to me years ago, I would say if you took away the development program, Dad wouldn't be as happy as he is. That is what he lives for. And I think that was very true. And it was a marvellous story. When I was there in 1994 with the Australian team, and he took me to many of the townships. I went into Alexandra, into Langa, and to Kahiso, and to many of the townships. And it was quite remarkable, the work that was being done there. It had begun a little before 86, in fact, and he ramped it up in 86. And Baker's Biscuits, who have been the tremendous supporters of the development game there, has been really quite remarkable. And he was as accessible there. There was the captain of the Alexandra under-13s, I can remember recording at the time, was a boy called Sipo. And Sipo could get on the phone of a Saturday morning and speak to Ali as easily as Nelson Mandela could get on the phone and speak to Ali, or vice versa. And so I think what that did indicate was the man's humanity. There is a shyness about Ali Bacher, which is quite remarkable. I mean, you can call of so many things. He's a husband, a father. You could call him a human rights activist, a politician, a statesman, diplomat, marketer, publicist, administrator, fundraiser, promoter, philanthropist, you name him. I mean, it is just extraordinary, the number of things that he's done through his life in the name particularly of South African cricket. And of course one forgets that he was a medical doctor by profession who had very serious bypass heart surgery in his 30s. So really it is not just a remarkable sporting life, it is a remarkable life.
There are some people still in cricket, some cricket commentators, who see him Some as a pragmatic opportunist, others a cynical opportunist. Now, you would have been against him in the 1980s, but now in your book, which is, of course, Australia versus the New South Africa, you write quite supportively of him. Do you see him as something better than a pragmatic opportunist?
Yes, I do. I think he is a humanist. I do think he cares. And I think it takes a lot of courage to say that you're in your 40s. He was 44 years of age when he said to himself and he said to his family, and indeed he said to the wider community, I've been deceived. I may have deceived myself, but I've also been deceived. Now, that takes pretty much a lot of courage to confront that and confront yourself and then go about reparation. And he went about reparation in the most dramatic way, bringing international cricket to South Africa and being such a leading figure right through on the international stage. And I think it's still quite possible, Warwick, that he will fulfil another role in international cricket somewhere in the future. I don't think we've heard the last of Ali Bacher in the cricket context. But yes, I think the reparations you've made has been dramatic. I do think he's a humanist. I think he cares deeply about the New South Africa. He could have left the place like many, of course, have left South Africa. He sought to stay and he's made a significant difference. And I think history will see him kindly and in that way.
So we're not inclined to overrate the role that cricket's played in bringing about the new Rainbow Nation?
No, not at all. In fact, Nelson Mandela was very quick to say in one of the earliest of all his press conferences when he emerged and formed government that sport, but particularly cricket, had played a very, very significant role in an understanding in the wider community of what can be achieved. So in many ways, cricket did hold a beacon, and that's to the credit of the game, credit to Bacher, and credit to the cricket community throughout South Africa.
Mike Coward. On Radio National, this is The Sports Factor, and I'm Warwick Hadfield. Despite coming from a non-cricket background, Nelson Mandela has a deep knowledge of the game, one that he was able to draw on when this year he came to write the foreword to Bacher's biography. And 13 years ago, it was an off-the-cuff remark from Mandela that led directly to South Africa playing in the 1992 World Cup. In 1991, as apartheid crumbled and the country moved towards democratic elections for the first time, the South Africans were readmitted to international cricket. However, it was thought there was too little time for them to be ready for the World Cup. A meeting between Mandela, Bacher and the former West Indian captain Clive Lloyd changed all that.
Clive came here for the very first time. I think that was in August of 1991. We've remained very close friends. And one day he just said to me, Ollie, I've got to see Mandela. And I phoned Steve, and within 24 hours we went to Shell House, which was in the headquarters of the African National Congress. And we were taken up to the top floor, and we were waiting to meet him with Steve Schwetty. And I can recall there was a delegation from Sweden, and the international media were there. And the door opened, and Mr. Mandela saw Steve, and he says, Steve, bring in Ollie and Clive. And the media just followed. And we were only with him for about 2-3 minutes. And he was complimentary about the development program. And then one journalist said to him, what about South Africa playing in the 92 Cricket World Cup?
This was a Swedish journalist who would normally have had no interest in cricket?
Absolutely. And he said, of course they must play. They must be invited. And that went round the world, and that was it. It was as simple as that.
Now, you called him then Mr. Mandela, but I understand he insists that you don't call him Mr. anymore.
Yeah, just before the 2003 Cricket World Cup started in South Africa, it would have been end of January 2003, he phoned me, and the conversation went something like this, said, Ollie, I just want to wish you and your team every success for the ICC Cricket World Cup. And I said to him, Mr. Mandela, thank you so much. I really appreciate your call. He said, Ollie, my name is Madiba. I said, Mr. Mandela, where I come from, if you respect somebody enormously, you call him Mr. He then replied immediately, Ollie, where I come from, if you don't call me Madiba, you're not regarded as a friend of mine.
Can you have ever imagined in those dark days in the 70s and certainly in the 80s and during that Gatting tour when the whole of non-white South Africa seemed to be against you, that Nelson Mandela would say such a thing to you and then write the foreword for this book?
It's absolutely a miracle which has happened in this country. I had views or thoughts in the 80s that we were awaiting a civil revolution, that there would be a bloodbath in this country. And you see, today as I talk to you, 10 years after democracy, it's an extraordinary achievement. You've got to give credit to people like Madiba, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, even F.W. de Klerk for going through a process which in 1994 created for the very first time a non-racial democracy in this country.
In the forward, Nelson Mandela says that when you beat the Australians 4-0 in 1970, he cheered your team and its achievements, even though he didn't like the fact that you were chosen solely on the basis of race. Why has Nelson Mandela, do you think, been so supportive of sport, cricket and soccer, and I guess to a lesser extent rugby, although he took a huge part in that as well? Did he see from a long way back that sport would have a huge part to play in the new South Africa?
This was exemplified during 1995, where he was so astute in using the Rugby World Cup and the Springbok rugby team to bring white and black South Africans together. And in a very controversial decision, just before the start of the final when we played New Zealand, he went onto the field with a Springbok rugby jersey. And that ground, there were about 70,000 people, mainly white. I was there, and they were chanting, "Nelson, Nelson." It was an extraordinary event. And the reason he did that, and he told me this later, that he knew that the Afrikaner, for them, the Springbok emblem in particular, was so important to them. And he wanted to express his appreciation to them for accepting him as their president and for accepting the new democracy in South Africa.
Officials from other cricketing bodies in South Africa were as forgiving as Mandela when Bacher suggested they become one organisation, the United Cricket Board of South Africa.
It's another extraordinary achievement or event. The first ever meeting we had with the Black South African Cricket Board under the chairmanship of Steve Shwedi was in September of 1990. And it was extraordinary that this was about 6 months after the ill-fated Gatting tour. And that was the first time that I would have met Krish McAdoo, the president, Percy Son, the vice president. And I think both sides were tense, anxious, how the meeting would evolve. It started 11 o'clock in the morning. It finished at 1 o'clock. And just before we were going to adjourn for lunch, Percy Son got up and said, "Gentlemen, why aren't we fighting?" And just indicates to, the power of communication.
Ali Bacher is no longer involved in the day-to-day running of South African cricket, but his legacy lives on. These days, Sean Pollock, the son of Peter Pollock, a legend from Bacher's all-white South African team of the 1960s, shares the new ball with a Causa paceman, Makhaya Antini. As well as the township program, a quota system has been used in provincial cricket in South Africa to help bring through more players from non-traditional areas. Bacher accepts, though, there's still a long way to go.
We need more representativity from the different peoples of this country, but I believe that process is irreversible. What you have proposed will happen. It will be good for the game of cricket to get 40 million South Africans totally behind their South African team, and that will certainly take place. When will it happen? I can't give you an accurate time frame, but I would be surprised that in 10 years' time, you don't have a South African team that is on merit, is dominated by black South Africans.
Dr. Ali Bacher. And sport will continue to play a leading role in helping South Africa get through all its problems. The country will host the Soccer World Cup in 2010, and they don't come any bigger than that. Now, the name of the book is Ali, The Life of Ali Bacher. It's published by Penguin, and it's out this month.